The late afternoon sun dipped behind the towering skyline of Manhattan, casting long shadows over Central Park. The city's pulse beat in the background, car horns, distant voices, the ever-present hum of life in New York City. But for Meredith Blake, this place was a rare sanctuary. Her morning jogs through the winding paths of the park had become her ritual, a way to escape the chaos that surrounded her successful yet stressful life. Meredith, a 47-year-old public relations executive, lived on the Upper East Side. Her life was curated to perfection, from her stylish apartment overlooking Park Avenue to her designer running shoes that crunched on the gravel paths of Central Park. For her, this park was more than just a green space. It was a symbol of control and order in her carefully constructed world. But as she rounded the familiar bend near Bethesda Terrace, something disrupted her usual tranquility. There, sitting on one of the benches that lined the pathway, was a man whose presence felt foreign to her pristine routine. His clothes were tattered, his skin dark and weathered by the elements, and his belongings, a ragged duffel bag and a threadbare blanket, were scattered around him. He was sleeping. Meredith's pace slowed, and her perfectly arched eyebrows furrowed. This wasn't the first time she had noticed someone like him in her park, but this time, it was different. This was her route, her morning, and she felt a wave of indignation rising within her. She approached the man with the same confident stride she used when closing deals in her Midtown office. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can't stay here. This is a public park, not a shelter." The man stirred, blinking his eyes open. His face, lined with deep wrinkles and marked by years of hardship, looked up at her. He wore an old, faded baseball cap pulled low over his brow, but even from under its shadow, his exhaustion was clear. Slowly he sat up and ran a hand over his stubbly chin. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice raspy from sleep. "I didn't mean to bother anyone. I'll move along." But Meredith wasn't satisfied with his compliance. Her heart pounded with an unfamiliar mix of fear and anger. "People like you," she said, her tone harsh and accusatory, "don't belong here. You're making this park unsafe for everyone else." The man nodded solemnly, standing to gather his few belongings. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat, as though he had heard these words many times before. His name was Gabriel Wright, a 53-year-old man who had once served his country, but now found himself homeless in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. Central Park, with its manicured lawns and elegant sculptures, felt a world away from the battlefields he had once known. Yet somehow it had become a battleground of its own, one where he was constantly reminded of his invisibility, his lack of belonging. As Gabriel slung his duffel bag over his shoulder, Meredith pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping furiously on the screen. "This is unacceptable," she muttered under her breath, dialing 911. "Hello, yes? I'd like to report a suspicious person in Central Park, near Bethesda Terrace. He's a homeless man, and he's acting aggressively. I don't feel safe." The NYPD was no stranger to calls like this, especially in places like Central Park, where wealth and poverty often collided in uncomfortable ways. Officers James Carter and Sophia Lopez arrived on the scene within minutes, their patrol car pulling up just off East 72nd Street, one of the main entrances to the park. Carter, a tall, muscular man in his mid-30s with a calm demeanor, had been with the department for over 10 years. His partner Lopez was younger and sharper, with quick reflexes and a no-nonsense attitude. As they approached, Meredith was already playing her part to perfection, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of passers-by. "There he is, officer," she said, pointing dramatically at Gabriel. "I asked him to leave, and he got aggressive. He's making the park unsafe." Officer Carter glanced over at Gabriel, who was seated quietly on the bench, his hands resting on his lap in plain sight. There was something about the man's posture that struck Carter as familiar. The way he held himself, the quiet dignity, even in the face of Meredith's accusations. Carter's instincts told him that this situation wasn't as dangerous as Meredith was making it out to be. "Sir," Carter said, approaching Gabriel, "may I ask your name?" Gabriel sighed and took off his cap, revealing a head of short-cropped, graying hair. "Gabriel Wright," he said, looking up at Carter. Carter studied him for a moment. His gut told him there was more to this man than met the eye. Mr. Wright, if you don't mind me asking, have you served? Gabriel blinked, clearly surprised by the question. Yes, sir, he replied, his voice steady. Marines, 20 years. Carter nodded, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Thank you for your service, Mr. Wright. I was in the Army myself, Afghanistan. He extended his hand, and Gabriel, hesitant at first, shook it. Meanwhile, Officer Lopez had her eyes on Meredith, who was still fuming. Excuse me, Meredith interjected, her voice rising in frustration. I don't see what his military service has to do with this. He's trespassing, and I don't feel safe. Carter turned back to Meredith, his expression firm but controlled. Ma'am, Mr. Wright hasn't committed any crime. He's in a public park, and as far as I can tell, he's not doing anything wrong. Meredith's face flushed with anger. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her hands shaking. This is unacceptable. I pay taxes and I expect to feel safe in my own neighborhood. You're just going to let him stay here? Officer Lopez stepped in, placing herself between Meredith and Gabriel. Ma'am, please calm down. You called us here to assess the situation, and that's what we're doing. But Meredith wasn't ready to let it go. Her voice grew louder, attracting the attention of other parkgoers. Nearby, a group of tourists paused to watch, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. An elderly man feeding the ducks shook his head sadly, while a young mother out for a jog slowed down, concern etched on her face. Officer Carter leaned closer to Gabriel, lowering his voice. Mr. Wright, is there somewhere you can go? A shelter, perhaps? Gabriel nodded wearily. There's a place downtown, but it's full most nights. I've tried getting into a program at the VA, but the waiting lists are long. Carter reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Call this number, Dave Thompson at the Veterans Center. He can help you cut through the red tape. Gabriel took the card, his hands trembling slightly. Thank you, officer. That night, Gabriel found a spot at a nearby shelter, using the $20 bill Officer Carter had slipped into his hand to pay for a meal and a bus ticket downtown. It wasn't much, but it was more kindness than he had experienced in a long time. Meanwhile, Meredith sat in her luxury apartment overlooking Park Avenue, glass of Chardonnay in hand, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. Her social media post was already going viral, detailing how she had been harassed by a homeless man in Central Park and how the police had failed to protect her. She uploaded the video she had taken, carefully edited to show only the parts that made her look like the victim. I can't believe this is what New York City has come to, she wrote. We pay taxes to keep our parks safe, and this is how we're treated. If the police won't protect us, who will? Within hours, Meredith's post had garnered hundreds of likes and comments, with people from all over the city chiming in with their support. But it wasn't long before other videos began to surface, videos taken by bystanders that told a very different story. In these clips, Meredith's anger and Gabriel's quiet resignation were laid bare for the world to see. The backlash was swift. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, some in support, but most condemning her actions. People she considered friends began to distance themselves. Even her workplace, a prestigious PR firm in Midtown, issued a public statement expressing disappointment in her behavior. By the next morning, Meredith's life had begun to unravel. Meanwhile, across the city, Gabriel walked into the Veterans Center on East 23rd Street, the card Officer Carter had given him clenched in his hand. The center was a modest building, nestled between high-rise apartments and chic coffee shops, but inside it felt like a lifeline. Dave Thompson, the man Carter had mentioned, was a tall, gruff veteran who had dedicated his life to helping men and women like Gabriel. Gabriel Wright, Dave said, scanning the room. Come on in. Let's see what we can do for you. For the next several hours, Gabriel was swept into a whirlwind of paperwork and meetings. Dave helped him get fast-tracked for housing assistance, set him up with a counselor for his PTSD, and even enrolled him in a job training program that was scheduled to start the following week. For the first time in years, Gabriel felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A small step toward reclaiming the life that had slipped away from him after leaving the military. As he left the center that afternoon, the business card from Officer Carter still in his pocket, Gabriel couldn't help but wonder if things might finally be turning around. But what Gabriel didn't know was that his path would soon cross again with the woman who had almost derailed his life. A week later, Meredith found herself walking through Central Park again, Though this time it wasn't for her usual morning jog. Her life had been turned upside down since the incident with Gabriel. She had lost her job at the PR firm, her friends had abandoned her, and she could barely leave her apartment without feeling the weight of judgment from strangers who had seen the videos. She had come to the park that morning not to jog, but to escape the suffocating guilt that had settled over her like a cloud. As she walked the familiar path near Bethesda Terrace, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on the same bench where their paths had first crossed. It was Gabriel. Her heart pounded in her chest. Part of her wanted to turn and walk away, but something stopped her. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the realization that she owed him something. Slowly, she approached the bench. "Mr. Wright?" she said, her voice soft, hesitant. Gabriel looked up, his eyes narrowing as he recognized her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice neutral. Meredith swallowed hard. I just wanted to apologize," she stammered. "For what happened. I was wrong. I treated you horribly. And I'm sorry." Gabriel stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he nodded. "Apology accepted, but words don't change much." Meredith nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. I needed to say it." Gabriel looked away, his gaze focused on the duck pond in front of them. "Change doesn't come easy," he said quietly, "but it's a start." The next few weeks were transformative for both Meredith and Gabriel. After their conversation in the park, Meredith began to take a long, hard look at herself and the choices she had made. She reached out to Dave Thompson at the Veterans Center, offering to volunteer her time. She started serving meals and helping with administrative work, humbled by the stories of struggle and resilience she heard from the veterans. For Gabriel, life was slowly improving. The Veterans Center had helped him find temporary housing, and the job training program was giving him the skills he needed to start fresh. But the memory of that day in the park still lingered in his mind. Despite Meredith's apology, trust was not something Gabriel gave easily. But as the weeks passed, Gabriel and Meredith found themselves working together more often, their initial awkwardness giving way to a cautious friendship. They never spoke directly about the past, but it was always there, a quiet reminder of how far they had both come. Just when things seemed to be settling into a new normal, an unexpected call shattered Gabriel's fragile peace. His daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to in years, reached out with devastating news. His ex-wife was gravely ill with cancer, and she didn't have much time left. Gabriel was torn. He hadn't seen his family in years, and the thought of facing them after everything that had happened was overwhelming. But Meredith, who had become his confidant, urged him to go. She helped him raise money for a plane ticket to California, where his family lived, and arranged for him to take time off from the job training program. As Gabriel boarded the flight to Los Angeles, he felt a mix of fear and hope. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side of the country, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on his family again. The flight to California was long and filled with memories Gabriel had tried to forget. As the plane touched down at LAX, he was filled with dread, unsure of how his daughter would receive him. When he walked through the terminal, there she was, Samantha, now a young woman in her late 20s, standing with her arms crossed, a mix of anger and relief in her eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her voice tight. Gabriel nodded, his throat dry. "I'm here now," he said softly. Samantha didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, she sighed. "Mom's in the hospital. She doesn't have much time left." Over the next few days, Gabriel stayed with Samantha, reconnecting with his estranged family, while facing the heartbreaking reality of his ex-wife's illness. Despite the years of distance, there was still love there, fragile, but present. He spent long hours at the hospital, holding his ex-wife's hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Back in New York, Meredith followed Gabriel's journey closely. She checked in on him regularly, offering emotional support from afar. When Gabriel ran into financial trouble with his ex-wife's mounting medical bills, Meredith sprang into action. Using her skills as a PR professional, she organized a fundraiser at the Veterans Center, rallying the community to help a man who had once been homeless but was now fighting to be with his family. The fundraiser was a success, and soon enough, Gabriel had the resources he needed to stay by his ex-wife's side until the end. Months passed, and after his ex-wife's death, Gabriel returned to New York, changed but stronger. He and Meredith continued to work together at the Veterans Center, their friendship growing deeper. What had started as a confrontation between two strangers had blossomed into an unlikely bond. One afternoon, as they sat together in Central Park, Gabriel looked at Meredith and smiled. "Funny how life works, isn't it? A year ago, we couldn't stand the sight of each other. Now, I can't imagine getting through this without you." Meredith chuckled, looking out at the duck pond. "I never thought I'd be sitting here with you either," she said, "but I'm glad I am." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Meredith turned to Gabriel. "You know, we've both changed, but you've taught me more about myself than I ever expected." Gabriel nodded, his eyes thoughtful. It's never too late to change. As they walked away from the park that day, both knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more opportunities for growth, but they would face them together. Two people from different worlds, united by a shared understanding and the belief that change, though difficult, was always possible.